The House chamber was unusually tense that morning. Whispers moved like wind between representatives. Something big was coming, everyone could feel it. But no one expected that Representative Jasmine Crockett was about to drop a political bomb that would leave a senator's career in ruins. Marco Rubio had just returned from a high-profile international trip and was confidently seated during a routine congressional oversight hearing. It was expected to be a standard session, updates, a few debates, and the usual political sparring. Then Jasmine Crockett, cool and composed, requested time to speak. As the floor was yielded to her, she took a breath, shuffled a few papers, and calmly said into the microphone, "I've hesitated for months. But the American people deserve to know what's been happening behind closed doors." The room froze. Cameras zoomed in. The media gallery went silent. Rubio's expression didn't change, but the subtle twitch in his jaw betrayed his nerves. Jasmine Crockett continued, her voice steady and measured, but each word hit like a hammer. "Over the past year, my office has received credible documentation, including financial records and internal communications, suggesting a pattern of influence peddling tied directly to Senator Marco Rubio." Gasps echoed across the chamber. Several members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rubio tried to laugh it off, offering a forced smirk, but his eyes darted toward his aides, who were already frantically typing on their phones. Crockett held up a folder, thick, marked, and tabbed. "It wasn't a prop. These aren't rumors. These are bank transfers, emails, recorded conversations. And they all point to Senator Rubio leveraging his committee position to funnel lucrative contracts to shell companies tied to his longtime associates." The chair tried to interrupt, urging decorum. But Crockett raised her hand and calmly replied, "I understand the seriousness of what I'm saying. And I'm prepared to submit every piece of evidence to the Ethics Committee and the Department of Justice." Today. Marco Rubio stood up, attempting to speak, but no words came. The pressure was mounting fast. Crockett leaned in toward the mic one more time and added, "This isn't political. It's about public trust. And someone has to draw the line." The room erupted. Reporters dashed to the exits. Social media exploded. And for the first time in years, Senator Rubio looked genuinely uncertain. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's bombshell disclosure, every major news network had cut into their programming. Clips of her speech went viral before she even left the chamber. Headlines like, "Crockett accuses Rubio of corruption, evidence submitted live," dominated every platform. Outside the Capitol, a crowd of reporters had already gathered. Microphones were pointed in every direction, searching for reactions. Political analysts scrambled to get on air. Some called it the biggest scandal since Watergate. Others warned to wait for confirmation. Meanwhile, Crockett exited through a back corridor, avoiding the media chaos. She handed over a sealed packet directly to congressional investigators, then another copy to a DOJ liaison already waiting in a private conference room. Her message was clear: she wasn't bluffing. Across town, at a private residence in Miami, Rubio's team was in full damage control. His press secretary issued a vague statement calling the allegations baseless political theatrics, but behind closed doors, panic was setting in. More troubling, insiders were beginning to flip. A former Rubio aide, who had left quietly 2 years earlier, suddenly went on record. He confirmed knowledge of at least 2 shell companies allegedly tied to the senator's brother-in-law, and hinted that there was more to come. In the Senate, whispers turned into open conversations. Members from both parties began privately discussing contingency plans. A few even reached out to Crockett to request a briefing. Rubio's silence only made things worse. The pressure was no longer political, it was criminal. By the next morning, the wheels of official inquiry were already in motion. The Senate Ethics Committee announced an emergency session. The Department of Justice confirmed receipt of the materials provided by Representative Crockett and issued a brief but pointed statement: the allegations brought forward are being reviewed under the appropriate legal standards. No one is above the law. Behind the scenes, subpoenas were quietly being drafted. Rubio's financial records, travel logs, and communications from the past 5 years were now under intense scrutiny. Federal agents were dispatched to question former staffers, contractors, and donors linked to the alleged shell companies. The Capitol buzzed with tension. News crews camped outside Rubio's office. Reporters chased staffers for comment. And inside private Senate meetings, the mood had shifted. A quiet but growing number of Republican senators began distancing themselves from Rubio. One even told a journalist off the record, "If half of what Crockett said holds up, we're not looking at a scandal, we're looking at a resignation, or worse." Crockett, for her part, refused to do a media tour. She issued only one statement: "This was never personal. It's about accountability. Let the facts speak for themselves." That restraint only strengthened her credibility. But the most shocking turn came just 48 hours later, when a second whistleblower stepped forward. This one wasn't a former staffer. It was a current federal contractor, with direct knowledge of a defense deal Rubio had allegedly manipulated in exchange for campaign donations. And he had documentation. The second whistleblower's testimony was the spark that lit a political firestorm. In a closed-door session with federal investigators, the contractor presented signed memos, meeting transcripts, and internal invoices, clearly outlining how a government defense contract had been steered toward a front company with no previous record, allegedly due to Rubio's personal involvement. The documents linked the deal to a suspicious political action committee that had quietly funneled over $600,000 into Rubio-aligned campaigns. Word leaked fast. CNN and MSNBC broke the story within the hour. Even traditionally conservative outlets couldn't ignore the gravity. Phrases like criminal liability, resignation pressure, and bribery investigation dominated the news cycle. Within the Capitol, the pressure reached a boiling point. Rubio finally released a video statement, looking tired, defensive, and visibly shaken. "These allegations are politically motivated. I have always acted in accordance with the law. I will fully cooperate with any investigation." But it was too little, too late. Hours later, several bipartisan members of the Senate Ethics Committee released a rare joint statement. "Given the seriousness of the claims, and the corroborated documentation now available, we recommend Senator Rubio temporarily step down from his committee leadership positions pending the investigation." That recommendation quickly turned into a formal motion. And then, an even bigger shock. Senator Lisa Murkowski and Senator Raphael Warnock co-sponsored a resolution calling for Rubio's expulsion from the Senate, citing gross misconduct and breach of public trust. It was the first serious expulsion attempt in decades. The Senate chamber was stunned. Jasmine Crockett, watching from the House floor, remained silent. She had said what she needed to say. Now, the institution had to decide what came next. The expulsion resolution sent shockwaves through Washington. Expelling a sitting senator was almost unheard of, only a handful had ever faced such a fate in U.S. history. But this case was different. The evidence was damning. The public outrage was growing. And senators were under enormous pressure from their constituents to take a stand. Cable news aired non-stop coverage. Protesters gathered outside the Capitol, some demanding justice, others chanting in defense of Rubio. Social media was a battleground. Behind closed doors, Rubio met with his closest allies. Many urged him to resign quietly to preserve some dignity and avoid what was becoming an inevitable vote. But he was defiant. "I've spent my life serving this country. I'm not walking away because of a political hit job." Still, his base in the Senate was eroding. Moderate Republicans began breaking ranks, echoing calls for accountability. Senator Tim Scott publicly stated, "This isn't about party. It's about principles. If these documents are accurate, then we have a responsibility to act, no matter who it is." Meanwhile, Representative Crockett remained laser-focused. She refused interviews, didn't gloat, and stayed off the airwaves. Her restraint only amplified her impact. The Ethics Committee formally recommended expulsion just 3 days later. The vote was scheduled for the end of the week. And then, in a desperate move, Rubio made a final plea. He requested to address the Senate floor directly before the vote. The chamber granted his request. What he said next would determine everything. The Senate chamber was packed. Every seat was filled. Staff lined the back wall. Cameras were positioned at every angle. The tension was so thick, you could feel it. Marco Rubio walked in slowly, flanked by two aides, holding a small stack of papers in his hand. He approached the podium, looked around the room, then took a long pause. I've stood in this chamber for over a decade. I've fought for issues I believed in, worked with many of you, across party lines, and tried to serve my state with honor. A few senators nodded silently, but most remained still, arms crossed, watching closely. What's happening here today, he glanced down at his notes, then back up, is more than an investigation. It's a trial by public opinion. Based on allegations, documents I haven't been allowed to fully review, and a political climate eager for a fall guy. Gasps came from the gallery. Some senators exchanged glances. He continued. Have I made mistakes? Probably. Have I blurred lines to push an agenda I believed was good for Florida? Possibly. But never, have I accepted a bribe, sold my vote, or compromised national security for personal gain. He stepped away from the mic for a moment. Then, in a quieter tone, I won't beg for my job. I'll let the vote speak for itself. But know this, one day, when the smoke clears, the truth will come out. And I'll still be standing. Rubio walked back to his seat in silence. The room was still. No applause. No reaction. Moments later, the roll call began. One by one, senators stood to cast their votes. And slowly, but steadily, the numbers moved toward an outcome no one thought they'd witness in modern politics. As the clerk called each name, the tension in the chamber built like a drumbeat. Senator Baldwin. Aye. Senator Barrasso. No. Senator Booker. Aye. On and on it went. Some voices were firm. Others trembled. A few senators looked away after voting, unable to meet their colleagues' eyes. But the direction was becoming clear. The ayes were adding up, faster than expected. Halfway through, the count was already leaning toward expulsion. Outside the Capitol, crowds watched live streams on their phones. Inside newsrooms, anchors struggled to keep up with the historical gravity. It was the first time in over a century that a sitting senator might be voted out not for a crime already proven in court, but for a loss of trust, ethics violations, and overwhelming bipartisan demand for accountability. When the final name was called, the presiding officer looked up and announced, by a vote of 72 to 28, the Senate hereby adopts the resolution, and Marco Rubio is officially expelled from the United States Senate. A gasp rippled through the room. Some senators looked stunned, even those who voted aye. Others exhaled, as if a heavy weight had lifted. Rubio sat motionless for several seconds, then slowly stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the chamber. He didn't say a word. No reporters were allowed inside the corridor as he left. No press conference. No team to spin it. Just silence. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett, seated across the Capitol in the House chamber, glanced at her phone where the news alert flashed across the screen. She closed it quietly and returned to her work, saying nothing. The country had just witnessed history. But the fallout was only beginning. The nation was still in shock. Within hours, every major outlet labeled it the biggest political fall from grace in modern Senate history. Op-eds flooded in, some praising the decision as a powerful stand for ethics, others warning of a dangerous new precedent. Rubio's office was cleared out the next morning. His nameplate removed. His digital profiles wiped from Senate directories. The desk he once sat at now stood empty, a stark symbol of how quickly power can vanish in Washington. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice confirmed that a federal investigation was now active and ongoing. Rumors swirled that criminal indictments could follow, not just for Rubio, but for several business associates and staffers connected to the schemes. But for Jasmine Crockett, the moment wasn't one of celebration. She returned to her district quietly. In a press conference, she said, "This wasn't about vengeance. It was about integrity. We don't need perfect leaders, we need honest ones. And we have a duty to protect the institutions that serve the people." Her words went viral. Supporters hailed her as a defender of accountability. Her approval rating soared. Even those who disagreed with her politically couldn't deny she had changed the game. And change kept coming. A new wave of ethics reform bills was introduced in both chambers. Committees were formed to audit other contracts and lobbying practices. The ripple effects of Rubio's ousting extended far beyond his seat. One thing was clear: Congress would never operate the same again. Weeks passed, but the echoes of Rubio's expulsion still reverberated through Washington. Special elections were announced to fill his vacant seat. Multiple candidates, both Republicans and Democrats, scrambled to position themselves as voices of reform. But none could escape the shadow of what had just happened. Meanwhile, other senators began voluntarily disclosing more of their financial dealings, hoping to avoid the kind of scrutiny that brought down one of their own. Transparency became more than a buzzword, it became a political necessity. In committee rooms and private meetings, Jasmine Crockett's name held new weight. She had gone from a rising progressive voice to a national symbol of accountability. Her refusal to sensationalize the scandal or make it personal earned her respect across ideological lines. An independent ethics watchdog group later released a report calling Rubio's case the wake-up call Washington needed. But in the heart of it all, Crockett kept her focus on legislation, criminal justice reform, voting rights, and expanding ethics guidelines for public office. When asked by a reporter if she felt vindicated, she simply said, "This was never about me. It was about doing what's right when no one else would." As the new congressional session began, with fresh members and a sharpened sense of duty, the Capitol felt different, still divided, still imperfect, but perhaps a little more honest. And for the first time in years, Americans watching from home began to believe that real accountability in government wasn't just a dream. It had happened. And it started with one voice that refused to stay silent. Just when it seemed the story had reached its end, another shockwave hit Washington. An anonymous source leaked a previously undisclosed memo to several journalists. The memo, buried deep in archived communications, revealed that multiple senior officials had been warned about Rubio's dealings years earlier, but chose to ignore them. Worse, the document hinted at internal discussions among party leadership about keeping the scandal quiet to avoid destabilizing the chamber. This revelation reignited public anger. A second wave of investigations was launched, not just into Rubio, but into those who protected him. Senators and staffers from both parties found themselves under scrutiny. A sense of betrayal swept through voters. The message was loud and clear: silence was complicity. Back in the House, Jasmine Crockett stood once again before the cameras, not for victory, but for clarity. "Let me be clear, this is no longer just about one man. If anyone knowingly helped cover up corruption, they're part of the problem. And they'll be held accountable." Calls for broader reform gained momentum. A bipartisan coalition introduced the Congressional Transparency Act, a sweeping ethics bill with mandatory audits, whistleblower protections, and real-time disclosure of financial conflicts. Crockett co-sponsored it. Public support soared. Petitions spread. Even some lobbyists issued statements backing the bill, realizing the tide had turned. In a matter of weeks, what started as one woman's courageous disclosure had evolved into a national reckoning. And the system, long untouched, was finally being forced to confront itself. The Congressional Transparency Act passed with overwhelming support, 89-11 in the Senate, and a landslide in the House. Presidential approval was swift. For the first time in decades, a true bipartisan reform effort had made it through the gridlock. Reporters called it the Crockett effect. What began as a single, fearless disclosure on live TV had unraveled one of the most protected figures in Congress, exposed a web of institutional silence, and led to the most sweeping ethics overhaul in modern U.S. history. Marco Rubio, once seen as a rising star, faded into the background. His political career ended not with handcuffs, but with disgrace, and a legacy that now served as a warning. He eventually relocated to a private consultancy overseas, rarely speaking publicly again. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's stature grew. But she never let the attention distract her. She focused on the work. On the message. On making sure no one in office would ever again feel untouchable. When asked years later what gave her the courage to speak out, she said simply, "I didn't come to Congress to protect careers. I came to protect the people who sent us here." Students studied the case in law schools. Activists cited it in town halls. And everyday Americans, many of whom had lost faith in the system, found a reason to believe again. Because sometimes, all it takes to shake the pillars of power, is one voice that refuses to look away. And Jasmine Crockett had been that voice.